Social psychologists look at how people behave in groups and why they can end up conforming with the rest of the group. When members of a group do this, they are responding to a social pressure. Social psychologists also study why people are obedient, even when they're being asked to do something that they know is wrong. This branch of psychology uses field experiments. This is where the studies are in everyday real situations, such as a street. But the participants shouldn't know that they're being studied, so the person carrying out the survey can watch people without the participants realising it, or they may even lie about the real nature of the survey or experiment. Hence, these methods can be criticised for being unethical, as the participants can't give informed consent. The catch is, if you told the participants that you were really watching them, they'd change their behaviour so the study would no longer be natural. Sometimes participants are debriefed after the experiment and can then choose if they want the findings used. They also have the right to remain anonymous. A useful thing about field experiments is that they can control an independent variable, putting people in different conditions which can then be replicated. What's really exciting is that sometimes we're able to establish cause and effect. Social psychologists sometimes use surveys. These can be in written form, such as questionnaires, or they may even use face-to-face interviews. The trouble with surveys is that people aren't always truthful. They may respond in the way that they think they should. We call this demand characteristics because they're trying to please the researcher. We also call this social desirability bias. So in other words, they want to appear in a good light, or they may not want the interviewer to know some of their personal business. Interviews take a long time. People have to be able to read and fully understand the questions in a questionnaire, and this can also take time. The response rate for such methods is usually low, so the sample of participants may not be representative. The distortion of truth may not always be down to the participant. Sometimes the interviewer may be biased and selective in what's recorded. Let's learn more about conformity.
Have you ever been in a situation that's new to you, where you don't really know the right way to behave? You probably watched everyone around you and followed their example. You conformed to the behaviour of the group because you didn't want to look silly. Have you ever said you liked a pop group or TV programme that you don't really? Have you ever worn fashion items that you don't really like, but you want to be seen as cool? In 1951, Ash carried out a very famous experiment into conformity. 50 male college students were given a task. They were shown a line and then asked to match it to one of 3 other lines. Confederates were used to mislead students. The Confederates answered first and said a wrong answer. Then, when it was the turn of the real participants, they were baffled. So they gave the same wrong answer. So they didn't appear to be different. They abandoned their own beliefs in order to conform. This is an example of conforming to the majority. This was a rather contrived situation, but there are examples of more real-to-life situations where people have conformed. In one, people sat in a room waiting to be interviewed. They saw smoke coming from under a door, but when one made a move, Confederates said, "We can't go, we were told to wait," and everyone carried on waiting. Unfortunately, people sometimes behave out of character, for instance showing violence or vandalism when in a crowd. We call this mob behaviour, and it's an example of deindividuation. We've seen how people in a minority can go with the flow and conform to a majority, but sometimes a minority group can influence the majority. This is how loads of social reforms happen, like suffragettes campaigning in the late 19th and early 20th century for women's right to vote, or the changes brought about by groups such as Greenpeace. let's look at conforming to the minority. In 1969, Moscovici did a study that was like the one Ash had done previously. But this time there were 2 Confederates and 4 participants, all female. They were shown 36 slides of various shades of blue. The Confederates said all or some of the slides were green. The participants then also said green for between 1.25 and 8.42% of their answers, an increase in errors of between 5 and 34 times. It appeared that the 4 participants were being influenced by the 2 Confederates. When the 2 Confederates said all the slides were green, the participants even conformed more. Hey, but that was a pointless and trivial task. People may not conform so easily when something really important is at stake. Sometimes people go with the flow to avoid confrontation and have an easy life. No doubt you've done this yourself. I know I have. Also, all of the participants there were female students, so not representative of the whole population. It's important to know about this though. I mean, think about it. This could affect how juries behave. Sometimes they spend hours deliberating to eventually come to a consensus, so someone must be influencing someone else. Okay, so when people are conforming, it may be because they want to be accepted by the group. They don't want to appear different, and so they succumb to the social pressure to be normal. This is called normative influence. Sometimes when people are in a strange situation, they look to others to see how to behave. This is informational influence. Other factors that can affect conformity are group size. The bigger the group, the more it exerts an influence. Gender. Females conform more than males. Personality. More confident people conform less. Knowledge. Someone who is knowledgeable will exert an influence and make others conform. Consistency. If the group sticks to its beliefs, others are more inclined to follow. Commitment. A high degree of commitment gives the group more influence. Flexibility. If the group is too rigid and won't listen to other viewpoints, it exerts less influence. Group identity. People are more likely to accept the views of others who are similar to them. Social trends. It's easier to persuade someone to change their behaviour if the behaviour is ranked as very socially acceptable. This takes time. Think how long it's taken to introduce smoking bans. 50 years ago, smoking was the norm and non-smokers had to suffer. Now smoking is very socially unacceptable. Whilst an undergraduate at Princeton University, Stanley Milgram had been Ash's research assistant. In 1960, he left Princeton to become assistant professor at Yale University. In 1963, Milgram carried out a very famous study into obedience. Now, this wasn't long really after the Second World War and the Nuremberg trials, where the Nazi war criminal, Eichmann, said in his defence that he was just obeying orders. Milgram thought that not everyone would obey orders when they knew it would harm someone else. He surveyed people before he did the experiment and asked them if they would harm someone else if told to do so. Now, the majority said they would resist and not obey. He advertised in a newspaper and men volunteered to take part. They thought it was an investigation into how people learn. Each participant was paired with a Confederate. The participant was, so it seemed to them, randomly assigned to be the teacher. The teacher and Confederate, the learner, were in different rooms. The teacher asked questions, and when the learner gave the wrong answer, the teacher had to pull a lever to give the learner an electric shock. The shocks weren't real, but the participants didn't know that. Each had to be bigger each time a wrong answer was given. Everyone went as far as giving 300 volts, and 65% of participants delivered shocks of 450 volts, enough to kill someone, even though they could hear screams and then a deathly hush from the next room. When participants said they wanted to stop, they were told by a man in a white coat, a figure of authority, to carry on. Later replications of the experiment have consistently produced the same level of obedience in both males and females. This experiment had high experimental internal validity, as the participants believed they were taking part in an experiment about learning. However, the situation was unusual and not part of their everyday lives, so it has low ecological external validity. The results were very shocking, as people thought that a situation such as what happened in Nazi Germany couldn't happen here. In this experiment, the participants couldn't actually see their victims, but then the same could be said of people inflicting damage on others during a war situation. If you think that was bad, listen to this one. In 1966, Hoffling carried out a study where a so-called doctor telephoned nurses and told them to give a larger than usual injection to patients and that he would sort the paperwork out later. Now, this doctor was unknown to the nurses. Hospital rules said that the paperwork must be completed first, but 21 out of 22 nurses were prepared to obey the doctor. But don't worry, they were stopped from giving the injections. This was a real situation as far as the nurses were concerned. The nurses showed a high level of obedience as they were prepared to break hospital rules. This experiment had high ecological external validity. In 1995, Mayers and Raymakers asked participants to test the reactions of job applicants to stress. Unbeknown to the participants, the job applicants were Confederates. As the participants delivered the stress remarks, the Confederates at first acted confidently and then broke down, imploring the participants, the interviewers, to stop. Although the participants could see how stressed the interviewees were, 22 out of 24 delivered all 15 stress remarks. This was a very realistic situation, and nearly all the participants, although it was a small sample, were prepared to inflict psychological pain on others. What makes us obey? Well, first of all, gradual commitment. We find it easier to obey if we're asked to do something a bit at a time. So, for example, Milgram's participants gave small shocks at first. Next, agentic state. If we think we are acting for someone else, or we have an obligation because we have agreed to do something, when it goes wrong, we can blame them. Next, authority figures. We're socialised to obey parents, teachers, doctors, police, and lawyers. So we are influenced by figures in authority. But also the place where we are is important. Milgram's study produced high obedience in the university, but when he did it again in run-down offices, the obedience rates were lower. Moving on to proximity. In the Milgram study, the teachers couldn't see the learners. What makes some people resistant to obedience? Well, the influence of others. If others are present who don't obey. Also, moral reasoning. If a person has high moral reasoning, they won't obey if asked to do something against their conscience, for example, conscientious objectors during the war. Another important factor is experience, as if someone knows how their actions may affect others. Next, the boomerang effect. We resist if we are pushed too far and feel our freedom of choice is eroded. Also, proximity plays a part. If the authority figure is not close to us, we find it easier to not obey. So, in a version of Milgram's study, where the man in the white coat was in the next room, fewer people obeyed. Lastly, personality. Some people don't obey on principle, and others are more compliant by nature. Milgram's experiment, like many other psychology experiments, raises important ethical issues. Some of the participants in Milgram's study suffered psychological stress by obeying and thinking that they were harming another person. They were also deceived as they didn't know the true nature of the experiment. But strangely, when they were debriefed, most said that they had learned something valuable from the experience and were glad that they'd taken part. Milgram said that the ends justified the means. As a result of this, ethical guidelines were drawn up by ethics committees. The British Psychological Society produces ethical guidelines for psychological research. These are that Deception is unethical, but it's necessary for some experiments. But it should only be used if absolutely necessary. So participants should be told about the deception during the debriefing. Also, participants should also give informed consent, although that's difficult if they don't know the true nature of the experiment. They have to be asked for consent during debriefing. Children cannot give informed consent, so their parents or guardians have to be asked. Participants should be protected from psychological harm or stress. Next, confidentiality. Researchers must keep information about individual participants private, unless the participant agrees for the information to be shared. Lastly, animals. Now this raises issues because they can't give informed consent, obviously. Some experiments have caused harm, sometimes to intelligent and sentient animals. Problem is, not all researchers follow the guidelines. If a psychologist doesn't adhere to reasonable guidelines, they can't be banned from research, so these guidelines have limitations. In this part, we've looked at social influence, or how people behave when in groups. Sometimes their behaviour is modified by the influence of the majority in the group, and sometimes the behaviour of lots of people can be influenced by the minority, demonstrated by Moscovici. You have also studied some of the research about why we obey people in authority by looking at Milgram, Mayus and Riemakers and Hoffling. We've also looked at ethical issues. You've seen that a lot of these investigations we've looked at raised concerns about ethics, and as a result, psychologists should follow guidelines that have been drawn up by ethics committees. Think about a type of research you would be interested in and the ethical considerations you would need to address.